The history of Lionhead Studios is a roller coaster ride of bad luck, personal conflicts, and unexpected triumphs. It surprised me to learn that many fans were divided about the studio. Some love them because of their unique games, but others hate them because of CEO Peter Molyneux and his empty promises. Peter Molyneux is a hard man to figure out. You see him at press releases passionately talking about features one minute, and then at others outright making absurd claims that aren't even technically possible. But despite how you feel about him, there's no denying the impact he's had on the video game industry. Without him, many of the games we came to know and love from Bullfrog and Lionhead Studios wouldn't exist. The history of Lionhead Studios is tied to the story of Peter Molyneux, and to tell that story, we have to go back to the very beginning. Back to where it all started in 1982 with a chance meeting between Peter Molyneux and Les Edgar. Molyneux needed a computer. The problem was he didn't have much money, so one day he popped into PJ Hi-Fi looking for a deal and began chatting up one of the employees there named Les Edgar. They eventually struck up a friendship and decided to go into business together. Their first company was called Toros Impact Systems, or Toros Impex Systems, and they made money by, I shit you not, selling baked beans. One day, completely out of the blue, Les and Peter get a call from Commodore International about a business opportunity. Confused but unwilling to risk a potential deal to ask why a tech company wanted baked beans, Molyneux hesitantly agreed to a meeting. After being picked up in the company car and taken on a tour of Commodore International, he sat down with the company president, and it became painfully clear that there had been a case of mistaken identity. Commodore wanted them to produce networking software for their Amiga, a type of personal computer that went on sale in the 80s.
Aren't you astronauts?
Buzz Aldrin, Gordon Cooper, Scott Carpenter. We like to compare notes with Stevie on the new space station.
Amiga from Commodore, the computer for the creative mind.
They offered 10 of the Amiga computers as payment for their service. Peter had always been obsessed with the idea of starting his own studio and making video games. It'd been his dream ever since he turned 17 and stole money from his grandmother's purse to buy Pong. He didn't have the money or the right tech to make video games just yet, so this deal was much too tempting to pass up. If they managed to pull this off, they could have exactly what they needed to open a studio. He agreed to make the software and walked out of Commodore International with the Amigas. Edgar and Molyneux worked like crazy over the next few months, ducking calls and pushing back deadlines, until Commodore's president eventually threatened them with legal action. They managed to stall Commodore just enough to unveil a database program called Acquisition at a German software show. Acquisition went on to win first prize and sold over 2,000 copies in North America. Commodore, obviously satisfied with the results, pulled the legal threats and let Toros off the hook. With the money they'd made from selling copies of Acquisition and the stolen Amiga systems, Molyneux and Edgar opened up Bullfrog Productions in 1987. The lie to Commodore had given them enough money to open a development studio, and another lie would get them their first job. Molyneux contacted a game development company called Firebird and made a deal to port one of their games to the Amiga. The problem was, neither of them knew how to code for games. After Firebird handed over the assets for Druid 2, Molyneux and Edgar began to learn how to program by screwing around with the in-game sprites and testing different lines of code, until eventually they ported the game for real. It didn't get the company much money, but it gave them enough experience to muddle through their own video game development. Their second project was a shoot-'em-up called Fusion that released on the Atari ST and Amiga system in 1988. Fusion didn't really sell. In fact, it barely made enough money to keep the company above water. This was a huge morale blow for Bullfrog, and especially for Molyneux. This was his entire life's ambition literally falling apart right in front of his eyes. Les Edgar suggested they dissolve the company to save what little money they had left, but Molyneux wanted to press ahead and give development one last shot. If this next game failed, Bullfrog would most certainly go under. With the knowledge they'd gained from porting Druid 2 and the work they'd done on Fusion, the Bullfrog team created their first big hit, a god game called Populous. Populous allowed a player to literally assume the role of god and control the world. It also went on to shatter sales expectations, win dozens of awards, and give Bullfrog the capital it needed to not only stay afloat, but expand their operations out of the attic and move to Surrey Research Park. Over the next few years, Bullfrog released 3 more games, but actually had plans for 4. Powermonger, Theme Park, Magic Carpet, and Creation. Powermonger was pretty much exactly like Populous, except it used a 3D engine for map topography, and you couldn't really screw with the terrain like you could in Populous. It sold pretty well, though it only exists because EA wanted more games like Populous. Theme Park was a business simulation game that allowed the player to create and manage an amusement park. I actually played Theme Park quite a bit as a kid. You literally felt like you were involved with every decision happening in the park. From the cost of admission to the cost of ice cream at a vendor stall, you were in control of everything. This game became incredibly popular in Japan of all places, and eventually sold over a whopping 15 million copies worldwide. After Theme Park, Bullfrog created Magic Carpet, which was great. You played as a wizard, trying to kill other wizards and monsters who would attack you on your own flying magic carpet. You were supposed to go around and collect mana from the creatures you defeated that allowed you to cast spells. It earned glowing reviews and eventually claimed the title of 137th best game ever. Then came Creation, a game that unfortunately never saw release because it was cancelled. Creation would put you in the seat of commanding a submarine on a planet called Creation. Essentially, Earth's oceans had been destroyed by pollution, and in order to save the marine ecosystem on Earth, we moved all the whales, dolphins, and sea life to this new planet to protect them. It was cancelled because publishers wanted Bullfrog to focus exclusively on games they knew would sell, Populous 3 or something equally as marketable. Molyneux became the public face of Bullfrog and main PR hype man. In interviews for Theme Hospital, he'd talk about how connected the theme games would be, like if a passenger in Theme Park got injured, how they'd eventually show up as a patient in Theme Hospital. Or how in Syndicate, the game's billboards would play full-length DVD movies if you wanted them to. Interviews like this no doubt improved sales for Bullfrog's games, but many who dived into Theme Hospital and Syndicate soon realized that a lot of what Molyneux had said just wasn't true. Theme Hospital had no connection to any of the other theme games, and the technical logistics of what Molyneux proposed were extremely complicated. In Syndicate, the billboards really could play videos, but not DVDs like he'd said. Most computers didn't even have DVD drives at the time. Though these earlier interviews weren't as widely publicized as some of the press releases that would eventually get Molyneux in trouble, it still created wide distrust of Molyneux's promises, which would persist over his entire career. Molyneux and Edgar eventually did decide to sell Bullfrog Productions, but it wasn't to Sony or Philips like many thought. It was to Electronic Arts in 1995. Once the company was purchased, Molyneux was promoted to Vice President of Electronic Arts and head of the European division. Edgar became his vice president, and Bullfrog Productions grew to over 150 employees. Once part of EA, Bullfrog worked an insane production schedule to create more profitable games. At one time, they had 7 games in production. At the same time. 7 games. That's fucking insane. Even with the amount of people filling the studio, they couldn't possibly keep up with the crazy pace. Quality of the games began to suffer, and the magic of what made Bullfrog so great was gone. In Molyneux's own words, the studio grew and it diluted the talent. Not only that, but Molyneux himself was unhappy. He wasn't doing what he wanted to do, which was make video games. He eventually voiced these complaints to a good friend of his named Tim Rance, and finally admitted that he wanted to leave the company. Tim suggested he needed to get those pent-up feelings out in the open and just write a fake email to EA CEO Larry Probst about resigning. Molyneux typed up the email, and while reading it out loud, Tim Rance, being a massive dick, sent it. Did I mention they were both drunk? The next morning, Molyneux arrived at work to explain that the email had been a mistake, but the damage had already been done. EA went insane.
Well, boys, this has been real educational and all, but now let's part with that old EA Sports saying, "Get the fuck out of my building."
In an effort to appease EA and circumvent his ban at the studios, Molyneux moved development of Dungeon Keeper to his house, so he could still remain hands-on with the project. On August 1st, 1996, nearly a year before the release of Dungeon Keeper, Peter Molyneux, Mark Webley, Tim Rance, and Steve Jackson resigned from Electronic Arts and started an entirely new independent company, which would eventually be known as Lionhead Studios. Lionhead had one mission: create innovative games while remaining an independent studio. Molyneux funded the company with money he'd made from selling Bullfrog, and even paid for the entirety of the first game's development, which began in his own living room. Eventually they settled on the idea of making another God game, the same genre that led to their initial success, and proved to the world that Lionhead was a force to be reckoned with. They named their first project Black and White, a play on the dual facets of morality that they wanted to explore. In a wonderful article written by Wesley Yin Poole, former Lionhead employees talk about the culture at the studio and how certain game features were implemented. It's a damn good article that's definitely worth checking out. Anyways, one of my favorite stories from the article is how Black and White's creatures came about. While at Bullfrog, Molyneux became obsessed with the Tamagotchi toy that he wore around his neck at all times. For younger viewers who may not know, a Tamagotchi is a toy that lets you take care of a digital creature. You fed it, you cared for it, and if you were away from it for too long, it would eventually die. One of Bullfrog's leading bug testers, Andy Robson, made it his personal mission to see Molyneux's treasured Tamagotchi dead. One day, he happened to look into Peter's office and found the necklace on his desk, alone and defenseless. When Peter came back, he was absolutely devastated. His toy had been drowned in a cup of tea in one of the most British murders ever. He was close to tears before he realized how ridiculous it was that he was grieving over a fake pet, and that brought him to his next idea. If he was so bent out of shape about a toy, how could he make a player feel? Molyneux wanted people to connect with their creatures, feed them, love them, and care for them, like he had with the Tamagotchi. He wanted them to be sad when they got hurt, and proud when they did something great. He wanted the AI behind the creatures to be so complex that it allowed them to make their own choices based on player input. They learned behavior and formed unique personalities that would make a person feel attached to them.
Click and hold the action button, then move your hand to stroke him. Now stroke him by holding the action button and moving your hand over him gently. Stroking.
Development on Black and White took years. The people at the studio worked day after day, hour after hour, toiling away, building the game's complex AI, working out the design tools and resource library, which were often written entirely from scratch. It was supposed to launch sometime in the fall of 2000, but the complexity and the problems that arose during development pushed the release date back until finally, Black and White saw release on March 30th, 2001. The members of Lionhead Studios held their breath, hoping that the game they'd spent nearly 4 years making would be worth the wait. It sold over 2.5 million copies, won a Guinness Book World Record for its complex creature AI, and won dozens of other awards after launch. Black and White was critically acclaimed by multiple game review sites who lauded its gameplay, graphics, and wonderful sense of humor. But many who initially praised the game began to echo one critique months after the dust had settled. Black and White was overrated. A year later, Black and White Creature Isles, an expansion to the original game, arrived, and reviewers, eager to correct some of their initial praise they heaped on the base game, were much more critical this time around, leading to lower reviews and lower sales. Lionhead, fueled by the success of Black and White, had already moved on to the development of Black and White 2 and a few new company projects. Soon after their first game's launch, Lionhead established their satellite program, which helped small developers find publishers and also gave them access to resources that would normally be out of their financial reach. In exchange, Lionhead would take a share of equity in the company as collateral. The better a developer in the satellite program did, the more value would come from that equity. The worse a developer did, the less their equity share would be worth. It was a risky business strategy, but it had the potential to be quite lucrative if they managed to find the right partners. Eventually they signed 2 participants, Big Blue Box and Intrepid. Big Blue Box was helmed by Dean and Simon Carter, and they were developing an open-world RPG nicknamed Project Ego. Intrepid was helmed by Joe Ryder, Matt Chilton, and Terry Cottrell, and they were working on a caveman survival game called BC. Both studios were made up of former Bullfrog employees, who ventured out into the world to start their own companies after Bullfrog was sold to EA. After speaking with a few financial advisors, Lionhead was told that their best bet for survival was to become a publicly traded company. This would effectively allow people to invest in the studio in exchange for shares, thus funding game development. The problem was, you couldn't obtain a public listing with only 30 employees. You had to have more. You also couldn't go public with just one product. You had to have more products. Lionhead geared up for a strategy that would meet both requirements, if everything worked out according to plan. Over at Big Blue Box, Project Ego morphed into what Lionhead Studios would eventually become known for, a quirky, open-world role-playing game called Fable. Big Blue Box had been ambitious as hell in their projections for development, and were beginning to seriously stray off target budget, and were way off course in their development timeline. Lionhead stepped in to help and acquired Big Blue Box as part of the equity share investment. Then they collectively discovered a huge fucking problem. Fable was a black hole that ate nothing but money, and they couldn't afford to feed Fable the money it needed to be developed. The game would require a small army of programmers, artists, and bug testers to even see release. They needed someone else to handle the development costs, but who had that kind of money?
Hello, I'm Bill Gates, chairman of Microsoft.
Microsoft launched the first generation Xbox on November 15, 2001. In order to become a competing power against Nintendo and Sony, Microsoft was on the hunt for studios that would be willing to make Xbox exclusive titles. Microsoft got wind of an RPG being developed by the legendary Peter Molyneux, whose name held a great deal of weight in the gaming world and would lend instant credibility to their console. Ed Fries, one of the creators of the Xbox, and Shane Kim, CEO of Microsoft Game Studios, arrived at Big Blue Box headquarters and sat down to demo the game, which they of course instantly fell in love with. Simon and Dean were ecstatic, but once Fries and Kim got around to asking about Peter, the room grew hushed, and the Carters had to break the news that Peter was back at Lionhead and had absolutely no affiliation with Fable. Stunned and surprised that Fable was not only a great game, but that Molyneux had no involvement with the project, a deal was eventually brokered and Fable became an Xbox exclusive title. Microsoft swooped in and offered to fund the project and take some of the enormous financial burden from their shoulders. And if there was one company with the capital to fill a development black hole, it was Microsoft. Lionhead purchased Intrepid shortly after Microsoft took the financial burden of Fable away. Acquiring both satellite partners artificially boosted the amount of titles they were working on, and also increased the amount of staff on payroll. Both requirements to become a publicly listed company were finally fulfilled. On top of Black and White 2 and the movies, the core Lionhead team also took on development of Fable and BC. However, it quickly became apparent after a few months working on each game that they lacked the manpower and the funds to pursue all titles at once. Development on BC was halted indefinitely, and the staff of Intrepid were migrated to other departments inside the studio to complete work on the remaining titles. Even with 3 products in development, they could gain a public listing, as long as the market kept enticing potential investors. On September 11, 2001, the United States suffered one of the most violent terrorist attacks in its history, the bombing of the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. America was already in a slight recession in 2001, but the war on terror required an enormous appropriation of funds that had to be borrowed on a global scale. This led to a worldwide economic recession. The public listing that Lionhead Studios had been hoping for, had spent money on, had started new games for, had staffed for, was dead. Without a public listing, they would need to find money elsewhere to remain an independent developer, and they needed to find it fast. Private venture capitalists who funded some of their earlier projects were hesitant to invest their money back into the market, especially during a recession, and especially during a recession in an industry as risky as video game development. Despite Microsoft handling much of the fiscal responsibility for Fable, core developers were still assigned to Fable in order to complete the game on time. This left Black and White 2 and the movies without many of their senior programmers, artists, and developers, stunting development progress. Microsoft supported Lionhead all the way through Fable's development. They sent engineers and producers, whatever they needed to get Fable released. Properly backed with Microsoft resources, Fable had become a bit more manageable, but still required an enormous amount of effort to get running properly on Xbox hardware. While the graphics and game engine were complete by 2001, the story, gameplay, and other elements took years to catch up, delaying release. Fable finally saw release on September 14, 2004. In its first week, Fable sold 375,000 copies in North America alone, and 600,000 in its first month. It was the commercial success Lionhead needed, going on to become one of the most popular RPGs on the Xbox. Unfortunately, it also received quite a bit of backlash from fans, not because of bugs, glitches, or gameplay, but because of Peter Molyneux. In multiple interviews, Peter had hyped up features in the game, which were nowhere to be found on release, leading to a very public outcry by fans. On top of that, Peter Molyneux, who was both the frontman and main PR guy for Lionhead Studios, had gained quite a reputation for exaggerating features. Ultimately, this led to the infamous Acorn incident. Molyneux mentioned that Fable would let you have children, that it would span from the player's birth to the player's death, an entire lifetime, and that if you knocked an acorn off a tree, eventually, over the passage of in-game time, it would turn into a fully grown oak. None of these things appeared in the release, and fans were furious. Molyneux left a very public apology and attempted to explain his actions on a message board. He stated that the acorn thing was at one time being considered as an idea, but it took up too much processing power that would be better served improving the combat or the graphics. Despite the explanation and the apology, it did little to temper the anger from fans, who believed Molyneux was touting extraordinary features only to drum up sales for the game. After the release of Fable, this is normally where a studio would take some time to celebrate, but Lionhead couldn't afford to halt the development process. Black and White 2 and the movies still needed the studio's attention and focus. After finishing Fable, Molyneux and the rest of the management team pooled resources to work out the kinks on Black and White 2, which would see release on October 4th, 2005. The movies debuted a month later on November 8th, 2005. Both games were quite good. Nobody in the world would dispute that. But they weren't the commercial triumphs Lionhead needed them to be in order to justify the enormous overhead costs. Black and White 2 earned a pretty average aggregate review score, despite being, in my opinion, a marked improvement on the original, which was scored about 20% higher. The movies also scored pretty average reviews, despite being in an absolutely incredible game. The movies allowed a player to run their own movie-making studio, and was made with the idea of being able to share those movies with the world. To this end, Lionhead Studios created the Movies Online, a site dedicated to hosting videos uploaded by the players. At the time of release, YouTube was not the internet power we know and use today. In fact, the site didn't officially launch until December 15th, 2005. It's my personal belief that the movies would have been a much greater hit had YouTube been operating with the same traffic capacity as today. With the movies in Black and White 2 failing to meet sales goals, Lionhead's status as an independent developer was in serious jeopardy. They'd spent money, resources, and time jumping through hoops to gain a public listing, and with only Fable going on to become a commercial success, they were forced to face some pretty stark realities about their financial situation. Some experts estimate that Lionhead, at this time, may have been operating with costs close to $1 million a month. In order to cut those costs and save the company, they were forced to lay off 90 employees. After the mass firing of Lionhead staff, Mark Healy, Alex Evans, David Smith, and Kareem Etourné, who knew the company was in serious trouble, also stepped down. Molyneux and the remaining leadership met with two companies in order to evaluate a potential buyout: Microsoft and Ubisoft. Of course, Microsoft wanted Fable to remain an Xbox exclusive, and with the amount of money they had to throw around, it was easy to predict who would eventually win the bidding war. On April 6, 2006, Microsoft announced the purchase of Lionhead Studios for an unreported sum of money, ending the 10-year status of Lionhead Studios as an independent developer. Lionhead Studios fought as hard and as long as they could, but their enormous costs and the lack of sales from their new games had finally caught up with them. Microsoft was nothing but helpful in the transition, and whether that was for the sake of the next Fable game, or they firmly believed Lionhead could be a valuable business partner, I honestly can't say. But just 10 years after this purchase, Lionhead's doors would close forever.